Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our event with David Livingstone Smith and David P. Barash. I'm Evan Karp. I'm the events manager for Booksmith. We're an independent bookstore in a mainstay of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district since 1976. Here to discuss the book and some of its themes is David P. Barash. David Barash is an evolutionary biologist and professor of psychology emeritus at the University of Washington. He's written more than 250 peer-reviewed scientific articles on human and animal behavior and has written, co-authored, and edited 39 books, most recently Threats, Intimidation, and Its Discontents, which is just out on October 1 by Oxford University Press. And David Livingstone Smith is professor of philosophy at the University of New England in Bedford, Maine. He's written or edited 9 books, including Less Than Human, Why We Demean, Enslave, and Exterminate Others, which won the 2012 Anisfield Wolf Award for nonfiction. His work has been translated into 7 languages. David is an interdisciplinary scholar whose publications are cited not only by others, but also by historians, legal scholars, psychologists, and anthropologists. He's been featured in several primetime television documentaries, is often interviewed and cited in the national and international media, and was a guest at the 2012 G20 Economic Summit, where he spoke about dehumanization and mass violence. With all of that, I would like to welcome David Livingstone Smith. Congratulations on the book, and David P. Barash, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our pleasures. So I'm assuming it's appropriate for us to start. I'd just like to start off by saying, David, what a real pleasure it is to be here with you, in a sense, although we're at opposite ends of the country, and what a pleasure it was, in a real sense, to read your book. Even though, as we'll go on, it'll be clear it's not pure pleasure in the sense of having a great time, but it's extraordinarily important. I just want to comment that usually there's an inverse correlation, I think, between how, maybe not usually, but often, between how important a book is and how readable or how accessible it is. I think that's unfortunate. In your case, in the case of your book, very fortunately, that's not the case. It's both very important and very accessible. And
oh, thank you. Thank you. I mean, that was the idea. I think the topic is much too important to be restricted to a few academics to read. I wrote this book for everyone, and I'm glad that I succeeded in making it accessible.
I feel very strongly that you did, and there's a whole lot of conceptual richness in it, and I have no doubt we'll get into that. But for starters, if it's okay with you, I'd like to jump right into some of the practical social and political consequences of dehumanization. The poet W.H. Auden wrote, ironically, in one of his poems, "Poetry makes nothing happen." I don't think he even believed that. Some people would say philosophy makes nothing happen. And yet here you are, a philosopher who clearly wants to make something happen. So I guess I'd really like to ask you to explain that.
Okay, so I might understand what you said in 2 different ways, a typical philosopher's response. One way would be, it's puzzling that here's a philosopher who wants to make some things happen, and the other way would be to articulate what I want to make happen by writing this book. Now, my approach to philosophy is figuring stuff out. I mean, this is what I want to do. I want to figure stuff out. And I want to concentrate on topics that promise to make a difference to life on Earth, be it human life or the life of non-human organisms. I'm not interested in playing mind games, doing what I call high-class Sudoku. I want to change the world with the meager tools available to me. And my most effective tool, I think, is writing. So I think you should think of philosophers as ideas people, right? I'm an ideas man. I'm interested in big questions and big answers. Now, I wrote this book because I've become convinced, and really this has autobiographical roots in growing up in the Deep South in the 50s and 60s, that dehumanization is a very, very important phenomenon. It's not been studied properly. And if we want to do something about it, as we should, because it's linked to the worst things that human beings have done to one another, we need to understand how it works. We need to pop open the hood and look at the machinery inside and get a sense of what kind of forces are at play, both politically and psychologically, to make it possible for sane human beings to think of other human beings as dangerous, despicable, subhuman creatures. And I think this task, I mean, it has always been pressing, because this process rears its head from time to time, a genocide here, a genocide there, a mass incarceration here, racial oppression there. But we are facing very, very formidable problems right now. Perhaps chief among them being climate change. And with climate change, which I don't think anyone is going to do anything about, there are going to be massive refugee situations. And that will create, in my opinion, a perfect storm for the most toxic, the most horrible forms of atrocity to be perpetrated on others. So we need to get ready for this. We need to be prepared. We need to understand how this stuff works so we can, first of all, prevent ourselves from slipping into this mindset. And we all like to think we're immune from it. And on the other hand, take political and social action to constrain or prevent it from occurring.
You know what, I'm reminded as you were answering that so beautifully of a quote from James Baldwin. I'm not sure I have it exactly right, where he said, or wrote rather, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it is faced.
Yeah.
And, you know, you're being, unfortunately, I think, appropriately pessimistic about climate change. Are you equally pessimistic then about being able to change people's perceptions, people's use of dehumanization?
Well, to some extent, that depends on other people, right? So I like to put it this way. I take this from Cornel West. I am not optimistic, but I'm hopeful. And what I mean by that is what's important is to keep on pushing on. You know, if one is a pessimist, one might be wrong, right? So the point is to do everything that we can to secure the outcome we want. So I would like to think that I can have, in my small way, maybe only with my students or with the few people that read my book, on attitudes and behavior. But who knows?
You know, in that regard, David, I'd like to quote, I mean, I loved the whole book, but I particularly was impressed with actually the very ending, your last two sentences.
Yeah.
Very relevant to everything we've been saying, where they read as follows. Martin Luther King once said, "The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice." And then you go on, that's only half the story, because it only bends toward justice if we push it very hard to bend it that way. So I guess a major purpose of your book, in addition to the academic, scholarly investment in it and information that people will derive, is really, I gather then, and certainly makes sense, to help people push it.
That's what it's all about. Yeah.
So in this book, you do a very careful job of fine-tuning issues of terminology, as befits a philosopher. The differences, say, between racism and racialization, between inhuman and subhuman. By the way, this may be the only area in which we have a slight disagreement, in that my take on dehumanization, and you're the guru on it, I'm just the perceiver or reader, but my take on dehumanization is a bit like the Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart's comment on pornography, where he famously said, "I may not be able to define it, but I know it when I see it." And so I wonder if you could comment a bit on the importance of defining. You do it very well in the book, but I think for those those watching, the importance of making those definitions.
Yeah. So they're not definitions for definition's sake. The word dehumanization, ever since it entered the English language in the early 19th century, has been used in a variety of different ways as a name for very different phenomena. So even in the scholarly literature, the word dehumanization is used for 8 or 10 different things. Now that's a problem, and it's a problem if this collection of phenomena that we call dehumanization consists of processes that operate very differently. So I'm a big fan of fine distinctions, in that I want to separate what I mean by dehumanization from all the others. And it's not like they're wrong. It's just they're different. And I have certain reasons for preferring my conception of dehumanization. And I also want to distinguish it from nearby phenomena like racism, like misogyny, like ableism, like homophobia. There is some relationship between dehumanization and all those things, but I think each needs to be studied on its own to understand its inner workings, again, with the ultimate goal of doing something about these things. So if as I believe, dehumanization works very differently from misogyny, it's going to only muddy the waters if we lump them together. So that's why I spent a lot of time on definition, of separating my conception of dehumanization from other conceptions of dehumanization. And I may as well say what that is. In my view, dehumanization is thinking of others as less than human creatures.
You know, I found that it's interesting to me. Just the other day on the news, I read some quotes from the Pope's recent encyclical letter, where he essentially castigated those who, through their actions, quote, cast immigrants as less worthy, less important, less human. Mm. So you've got the Pope on your side.
Well, that's reassuring.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't think either of us are major fans of popes, but this one is a
hey, if you want a pope, this is the one.
Yeah, he's my favorite pope also. I agree. With regard to that, the issue of dehumanization, I'm sure you're familiar with the word othering. I'm interested in that. And I just, again, very recently saw a clip of Senator David Perdue in Georgia addressing a crowd, and he very intentionally mispronounced Kamala Harris's name. Kamala, he said, Kamala, la la la, whatever, and the crowd was laughing. They had a good time with it. You know, you don't hear people saying David Perdue doo-doo or something. You know, I can't help but wonder if there isn't an intentional effort at othering, because here Kamala is a woman and Black and maybe more susceptible to the kind of othering, even though it's not quite dehumanization. Isn't it kind of close in some ways?
Well, dehumanization would be a special case of othering. But again, othering is very, very broad. So just manifestly, the notion of othering doesn't entail hierarchy. In practice, it amounts to treating others or describing others or calling others something less. But hierarchy isn't explicit in the concept. That's one reason I don't like it. So we have the D of dehumanization, which implies hierarchy, implies less than. And it is very general. So other than what? I mean, other than us? Well, that can mean all kinds of things depending on how you understand the us. So I see othering, actually, that would be a word for this whole broad range of phenomena, from dehumanization to racism to misogyny to, the works.
Okay, yeah.
It's an umbrella concept.
But interestingly, at about that same time that Purdue was doing that othering, if you will, or maybe not, as you say, not dehumanization, as you so carefully define it, our dehumanizer in chief in the White House referred to Kamala as a monster.
Yes, correct. Yes.
Now you're kind of the world's expert on monstering, if you will. And I wonder if you if you care to expand upon that.
Sure.
Yeah.
There's a slightly intricate story to tell about that. So you all have to fasten your seatbelts for a little while here. The most toxic forms of dehumanization, the forms of dehumanization which are most prone to lead to terrible acts of violence and atrocity that are implicated in genocidal violence and so on, virtually always involve thinking of the dehumanized other as not simply a subhuman animal, not simply as lice or rats or some kind of ravenous predator, but as monsters or demons. And, we find this again and again and again. So my two, Exhibit A and Exhibit B in my book, and also want to give talks on this topic, are the lynching of African Americans in the United States and the Holocaust. And in both cases, we find this monsterization of the dehumanized people. And I think the way that comes about is very, very important. To make a long story bearable, the long story is in the book, and the longer story, just by the way, will be in my next book out next year called Making Monsters. So to make a long story bearable, as my grandmother would say, we have to ask ourselves what a monster is. What's a monster supposed to be? And for my money, the person who's done the best work on this is a philosopher named Noel Carroll. He wrote a really terrific book called The Philosophy of Horror. It's all about horror movies and horror fiction. And it's just a really good read, unlike 99% of philosophy books, which are stone cold boring, right? This is a page turner. And he asks the question, well, what makes a monster? And he argues that a monster has to have two properties. One is it's got to be physically threatening. It's out to maim you or to kill you, or to eat your brains or whatever the case may be. But it's going to damage your body somehow. Mm-hmm. But that's necessary, but it's not sufficient because, of course, grizzly bears are physically dangerous, and rattlesnakes are physically dangerous, and white supremacists are physically dangerous, and none of these entities are monsters. Monster has to have another property. It has to be an impossible fusion of mutually exclusive kinds of things. And we find that, well, he calls it cognitively threatening because it undermines our conceptions of the natural order. I use the term metaphysically threatening, but it's a very disturbing thing, and it's the fare of horror. So think of movie zombies, for instance. Well, they're alive and they're dead at the same time. That makes them really disturbing. On their own, they're teetering around and, they're not particularly formidable, but they're alive and dead. Imagine a disembodied hand crawling across the floor towards you. What damage can a hand do?
I'd rather not.
But it's really disturbing, isn't it?
Sure.
Because it's kind of like a fusion of a hand and a large spider. Yeah. So I think this process is at work when we dehumanize people. In the first instance, dehumanized populations are almost always at first, even before they're dehumanized, represented as physically threatening. They're terrorists, they're rapists, they're murderers. We find this again and again. Well, that's the physical threat. But they're also seen, and I can tell you why I think this happens, as human beings and subhuman creatures at the same time. At the same time. So you get something like the werewolf, you know, a wolf and a human at the same time. And I think the reason that this happens is that being the ultra-social primates that we are, when we encounter another member of our species, we just can't help seeing human. Bing, a switch is flicked, you look into a person's face, you respond, human. We've got no control over that whatsoever. But on the other hand, propagandists and ideologues promoting toxic political positions may convince us, you know, these others that look human, they're not really human. They're more akin to vermin. They're more like lice, or they're violent beasts. And we take that on board because they're supposed to be the experts, even though it contradicts what our senses tell us. It's often the case. You know, we go to science for a picture of a world which is often wildly different from our naive picture of the world. So those who are supposed to know give us an image of these others, be they Jews, be they Black people, be they Romani people, be they Rohingya, as subhuman, but we can't also help seeing them as human. And this monsterizes them. In other words, we have two contrary mental representations of them. And it's not like we see them as part human and part subhuman. It's not like, you know, their hands are not human, but their heads are human. Mm-hmm. What makes it disturbing is the idea, like with the zombie, they're totally human and totally subhuman. So that's the alchemy, the toxic alchemy of dehumanization that transforms people into monsters, which makes them all the more menacing seeming. And the tragedy, of course, is that it's typically the most vulnerable, the most marginalized people who are dehumanized. Those who are, in effect, the weakest people in a population.
You know, it reminds me when I was a kid and I used to watch the standard monster movies, you know, I was fascinated by Godzilla and Mothra and King Kong, but I wasn't somehow terrified of them.
Yeah, they're just big.
What's that?
They're just really big animals, right?
They're just big, ferocious animals, but by contrast, I was terrified of Dracula or of Boris Karloff's Frankenstein. Yeah. But there's something about looking like a human, but not quite. And that's unfair. It's like they're cheating. They're cheating us somehow. Yeah. Those dirty dogs are, I mean, that's what happens with the Jews, I guess, or the, you know, those who look like they look human, but deep inside they're somehow not. And that's really discordant, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's very disturbing. You just, by the way, you might be interested to know that the 1941 film, The Wolfman, was the writer of the screenplay was a Jewish refugee from Germany, left in the 30s, and the werewolf metaphor was based on some of his experiences under the Third Reich. And in that film, the werewolf is marked by a star on his palm, which is a very nice reference to that. So yeah, it's very important. The attitude of horror is very typical of what dehumanizers feel towards those whom they dehumanize.
You know, there's a phrase, I'm regrettably, I can't recall, it was initiated by a roboticist called the Uncanny Valley.
Yes, that's Masahiro Mori.
Okay, go for it.
1970. Now, Masahiro Mori, in fact, rediscovered, so there's a literature that I draw on to formulate this monster idea. Noel Carroll is just one of the figures. Masahiro Mori's notion, actually, let's go back before him to a man named Ernst Jentsch, who was a German psychiatrist. And he was interested in analyzing a particular feeling, which in German is Unheimlichkeit, which is best translated, in my view, as creepiness, eeriness. And he published this paper in 1906. And basically, he comes to the conclusion that we experience something as creepy when our minds are torn between two incompatible interpretations of the thing and cannot settle on one or the other. So one of his paradigmatic cases is figures in a wax museum. Right? You go in, well, why are they so disturbing? Well,
it is creepy. They are.
Yeah.
It is.
You look at them as, wow, that's the person there. That's, well,
Yeah.
I was going to say that's Donald Trump, but that would be creepy if it was Donald Trump. That's the person, but then there's something off, right? The skin is the wrong texture, the eyes don't move. And that's what elicits this disturbing quality. It's a person, but it's not a person. Once you can settle on an interpretation, then it loses its creepiness. Now, the English translation of Jensch's article translates unheimlich as uncanny, right? Now, Masahiro Mori in 1970 published a very short paper, it's like 3 pages, in a robotics journal called Energy, and he makes a prediction in this. He predicts that as we make progress creating humanoid robots, we will get more and more comfortable with them until they're almost indistinguishable from human beings.
Mm-hmm.
When that happens, he predicts a precipitous drop in our comfort levels, and that's what he called the uncanny valley. The Japanese word for uncanny is bukimi, which also can translate as creepy. I've been assured by native speakers. So Mori applies the same to prosthetic limbs. He said, if you're making prosthetic limbs, don't try to make them realistic. People will be put off. Make it clear that it's nothing like a fleshy hand, right? Because unless you can capture that perfectly, it will elicit an attitude of repugnance, right? So Mori is really rediscovering Jensch's work, but he doesn't cite it. And I don't know if he knew about it, but it's precisely the same idea. Yeah. And then there were some later writers who came at this same idea from different angles, anthropological angle, for instance. And I try to pull all that stuff together in On Humanity and also in my next book on Making Monsters.
So one of the things that I found particularly interesting, well, there are many things I found very interesting in your book and very, like I said, both interesting and important, which is a wonderful confluence. We need more of that. Was your comment about the role of outside factors in evoking dehumanization as opposed to internal factors. And that leads you to a degree of optimism.
That's right.
And which I wish I shared it, and I'd love to be. I'm somewhat convinced by your book, and I'd love to hear more about it.
Okay, so let's go back to this issue of ultrasociality. Now, as you know better than me, social animals have to limit aggression, severe forms of aggression in the immediate community, because a social way of life is impossible if they're all ripping each other's throats out. So there are processes that damp down lethal aggression and even extreme sublethal aggression. In most social animals, this doesn't apply to individuals outside the local breeding group, right? So a stranger, strays, is in the wrong place in the wrong time, well, they can be torn to shreds. Yeah. We human beings, being ultrasocial, need to, and I think do, have very powerful inhibitions against lethal violence against one another. And that process of what I call seeing human, when we're confronted with the visual cues of another member of our species, has in my view, the effect of inhibiting aggression. That's why, in warfare, killing someone up close and personal is like really hard, and it drives people nuts. To look into someone's eyes and plunge a blade into them is psychologically so difficult. And veterans can be haunted, for a lifetime by the trauma of killing, not just the fear of being killed, but the trauma of killing. In our case, these inhibitions extend beyond the immediate community, the immediate breeding group. And in that respect, we're somewhat similar to bonobos, who extend their sociality much more than chimpanzees do. Okay, so if I'm correct, that when confronted with another member of our species, we see human, this tends to shut down aggression. There's another issue, and that is we got these great big brains, and we can think instrumentally and use our imagination to envisage various possibilities, one of which is, gee, wouldn't it be advantageous to get rid of those folks on the other side of the hill? We could steal all their resources, create Lebensraum, enslave them, do all that kind of stuff. Now, in that kind of situation, you could imagine people being between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, they see the attractiveness of acts of violence. On the other hand, they're just built in such a way that these acts are difficult. I think that over time, we develop various cultural gimmicks for selectively disabling inhibitions against performing terrible acts on one another. Dehumanizing propaganda is one of these. It's not the only one. People often get me wrong there. The use of intoxicating substances, mind-altering rituals, all kinds of stuff have been used, religious ideologies. Dehumanizing propaganda is one of them. So the way that generally tends to work, now we come back to what I said earlier, we dehumanize others, which enables us to override our inhibitions against violence when there are people in positions of authority, let's say epistemic authority, people who are supposed to know, who tell us that these others, don't worry, they're not really human beings. They're not human on the inside where it counts. They're counterfeit human beings. On the inside, there's something dangerous and toxic and evil that we've got to get rid of. So that dehumanizing impulse, I think, is generated externally and plays on certain vulnerabilities we have on the base, just on the basis of how our minds are configured. And you can look at for examples of that. If you take all the paradigmatic examples, the dehumanizing process is a psychological response to political forces, to propaganda, sometimes to entrenched ideologies in a community, where there's not like one person, like there's not a Dr. Goebbels or a Nazi race expert or a Louis Agassiz, who was a white supremacist. There's not one person, it's just distributed through a community. And so one acquires these beliefs then from respected people in the community, one's parents, one's pastor, the sheriff. I'm thinking of the Deep South when I was growing up, where this is all around. But you see, that process of taking on beliefs from others is essential to human culture, and it's entirely reasonable. Most of what we believe, it's not stuff we've observed, it's stuff we've read, stuff we've been told by people we give credence to. And the problem is when we give credence to people who are promoting dangerous political agendas. So we have something to build on, right? Our intrinsic horror of spilling human blood, if I'm right.
Yeah, you do write in the book that we're not natural-born dehumanizers.
Right.
So, but it seems like dehumanization, one way or another, has happened very widely around the globe. Actually, I spent some time in the Amazon, almost a year, a long time ago. It was 1960 something, 69. And some of that time was with an indigenous group called the Hivaro.
Yeah.
The Hivaro referred to people who were not Hivaro. I forget the word they had for it, but Hivaro was also their word for human. And
Yeah.
so by definition, the other groups were not human right away.
They were tapers, in fact.
Is that right?
The word translates to that. Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so there is a myth that it's a dehumanization is an exclusively European phenomenon and a product of modernity. Say it began in like the 17th or 18th centuries. That's utterly false. It's very pervasive. It's not universal, but it's very pervasive.
Is there, as far as you've determined, is there a common thread? If the common thread is not necessarily from within us, is there a common thread that is employed by the various dehumanizers, if you will, in order to evoke these responses or create these responses for their own interest?
I mean, a common thread, you have to zoom out so much that it becomes very general. I mean, the other is presented as dangerous typically, and salvation depends on exterminating them. I'm talking about the worst kinds of dehumanization. So for practical purposes for us, as opposed to the Hivaro, I'm very, very impressed with the work of a man named Roger Monicarl, whose work I described somewhat in the book and in a lot of pieces I've wrote about Trump, actually. Monicarl was a philosopher. He had a PhD in philosophy, he had a PhD in anthropology, and he was a practicing psychoanalyst. In 1932, a friend of his, a man named Arthur Jenkin, a diplomat, invited him to visit Germany. And he took him to the Hitler's rallies, where Hitler and Goebbels would get up and do their song and dance. And in 1941, Monicarl published a paper on his experiences called The Psychology of Propaganda. And what he said is this: look, if you observe these guys and you observe other authoritarian politicians, they do basically the same dance. The first move is to cause the audience to elicit depression and hopelessness, a sense of hopelessness. We're the laughing stock of the world. Everyone's taking advantage of it. You've betrayed the great destiny of the Aryan race. You know, our glory days are over, so on and so on and so on. And he says, when the audience is rolling around in an orgy of self-pity, the authoritarian leader changes his tune and says, yeah, but it's not really you, you see. It's not really you. It's the Jews, it's the communists. They're sinister forces destroying us from within. And
or
this is where
Latinos who are trying to enter.
Exactly. I mean, you could go to Trump's first speech when he came down the escalator. It's textbook. It really is. So then he gets them worked up into a paranoid state, which you're a sucker for if you got depressed in the first move, and then offer salvation. Join me, make Germany great again. You know, we'll brush our enemies away with an iron broom and you know, initiate the 1,000-year Reich, and so on. So humanizing propaganda often comes in that second step, that paranoid step. And it's a very, very powerful formula, this.
You know, one thing that I became aware of, particularly when rereading your book, and you do talk about it, is the problem of dehumanizing the dehumanizer.
Yeah.
And again, the name of Trump has come up, and I have to say, in many of my statements and some writings even, I am pretty dehumanizing about him. I don't use animal language because I like animals, and it would be it's unfair to the animals. And yet then I look at myself and say, wait, am I being?
Yeah, well, it can feel good to do, and one reason it feels good to do is it places the other at a distance. So you're othering him.
Yeah,
you're saying he's nothing like me.
Yep.
And we
not, damn it. That's right. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I know how tempting that was, David.
Yeah, I had to. Right.
And it's very striking with people who have committed terrible acts. I almost said monstrous acts, you see, like, like the Nazis. So it's easy to call them monsters, but the psychiatrist who at the Nuremberg trials examined these guys said they were like the sorts of people you'd meet at an average PTA meeting. They weren't insane. And monsters don't exist. Monsters are fictional.
Yeah.
So when we call them monsters, we're refusing to look into that mirror that they hold up to us to allow us to see what is possible for us. The people who got their hands bloody in the Holocaust, or any genocide you can name, were for the most part, to use Christopher Browning's term, ordinary men. They're ordinary people.
Good Germans, if you will.
Good Germans. The lynch mobs, the leaders of lynch mobs were like pillars of their community. That's very, very important to understand, because if we don't understand this, then just in virtue of not coming to grips with it, we render ourselves vulnerable to dehumanizing propaganda. We refuse to see that we too, under the right circumstances, can be Nazis, can be genocidaires, can be, whatever horror you want to name.
You have a chapter on illusions. You're a Freudian scholar as well, and I hardly know anything about Freud, really. I think of him as a kind of a brilliant crackpot who's, maybe really brilliant about 60% of the time and just off the wall the other 40. And I hadn't realized how he uses the word illusion. I had read Future of an Illusion, his work on religion a long time ago. And I think that it relates to what we've just been talking about, namely that whole question of finding a need within people. And I was not aware of Freud's use in that regard. And
it's a very subtle,
develop that.
It's a subtle idea. So Freud, when we think of illusions, we tend to think, well, an illusion is just a false belief or a false perception. But Freud doesn't use the term that way at all. For Freud, an illusion is something we believe because we want it to be true. It can, in fact, actually be true. You can get lucky. Diana maybe fantasized that when I grow up, I'll marry a prince, and she married a prince, right? So that was a true illusion. It was an illusion because it was purely wishful thinking, but hey, it panned out. But mostly they're false. So Freud's take on religion is that religious belief is a kind of response to our own awareness of vulnerability. Or his word is even more evocative, it's helplessness. We're able to reflect on our condition and recognize our helplessness in the face of the forces of nature. We're going to die, our loved ones are going to die. There are famines and there are droughts and there are floods and all sorts of terrible things that threaten us that ultimately, we can constrain a little bit, but we can't banish. Disease, pandemics, and also the injustices that human beings perpetrate on one another, right? We're helpless in the face of people who kill, who rape, who do genocide, and so on and so forth. So there are these two major sources of helplessness. That sense of helplessness, Freud thought, throws us back on experiences when we were utterly dependent on others to protect us from a hostile world. In other words, when we were infants. And that then produces the quest for a protective parent that's going to make it all right. The people who, first of all, we won't really die. We have an afterlife. The people who do bad things are going to be punished, whereas in fact they get away with it. But it's a reassuring idea, right? They're going to be punished. The good people are going to reward. All that stuff is straightened out. Now, the problem with this is that, as usual, Freud is very internalistic. You read Freud and it seems to all come from the inside, but that's not how people get religion, right? They have people scaring them into believing in God. These ideologies are foisted on them. Now, I think these religious illusions are very, very akin to political illusions. We have the same process going, particularly in authoritarian politics. The politician cultivates the sense of helplessness and then offers salvation, just as the religious authority does, right? So I think it's a really interesting text to read in relation to authoritarian politics. And in fact, when he wrote that, the Nazi movement was getting going. Freud was quite aware of this. There were pitched battles in the streets between the right-wing militias and the communists. It was 5 minutes away from where Freud was living. So it was a politically intense and threatening situation. And I can't help wonder if that's part of the subtext to this work.
So in that, I guess his use of illusion and the way you're describing it too is not the same as what Stephen Colbert called truthiness.
No.
I appreciate that. I guess another thing that occurs to me that I was intrigued by in your book, I was intrigued by lots of things in your book, okay? That's why I read it twice. But there's a chapter about impurity, and that certainly relates to the issue of monsters, the notion, I guess, of someone being close, almost human, looking human, but not quite, so they're subhuman and hence unacceptable, a challenge, a threat. I'm wondering, there's been a fair amount of research recently by social psychologists looking at sensitivity to impurity.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that much of that is associated with the political right. Very sensitive to impurity. And I'm wondering, do you think, is there an association then that extends to a greater tendency of the political right to engage in dehumanization?
I have to say, I'm a little skeptical of the social psychological research in that area. I think there's far too much emphasis on disgust. It's sort of a very impoverished moral psychology. So I think and this, harking back to what I said earlier, the attitude of horror is something which is very, very underestimated. And that's not the exclusive property of the right, right? And we get that with dehumanization, because dehumanization makes monsters. Now, the whole impurity stuff, as I use it, I don't like the term even. Abomination, I think, is a better term. And the anthropological work of Mary Douglas, who wrote a famous book, 1966, called Purity and Danger, is my go-to source for that. And it ties in with Yinch and with Maury and with Carroll on this whole idea of things that don't fit into the categories that we use to define the normal. Those things are impure, they're abominable, they're horrific, and we respond with repugnance to them. They need to be handled, they need to be locked away, they need to be managed. So when we dehumanize people and we render them impure in that sense, it elicits all of these attitudes. Elicits all these attitudes.
One of the things that is quite prominent in your book and very troublesome is the explicit descriptions of so much horror. And I have to confess that there were a couple paragraphs there where I couldn't bring myself to read the whole paragraph. I read the beginning and then a little bit at the end, and then I went on. And this speaks to the need, I guess, in that sense, I failed, the need to rub our own noses in some of the horror if we're going to really be motivated to confront it and do something about it.
Yeah, you know that sometimes when I give talks to philosophers, someone will say in the Q&A, like, oh, you have to be so graphic, it detracts from the argument. And I want to say that is the argument. That is the argument. And it's very important for Americans because we've gotten away with stuff, you see. Everyone knows about the German horrors. But we have been able to sustain illusions of American exceptionalism. And if we're to resist dehumanization, we need to recognize what we have done. And that we actually applies across the world, but now I'm talking specifically about Americans, and actually rather more specifically about white Americans. If you can accept that properly in all of its gruesomeness, then you know it's possible. And if you know it's possible, you know you're not immune, you see. And that speaks to the need for real historical education, which young people do not get in our school system, even at the college level. They don't get it.
So with regard to that, and you mentioned the United, the malefactions, the grotesque horrors, the misbehaviors of Americans in the past. And of course, this has been done by Japanese, by Germans, by the Hero, by just
you can name.
Yeah. So we've used the word dehumanization as though it's a single thing. And both you and I have an interest in war as well, concern about war. Yeah. And it's often been said, I think legitimately, that there is no such thing as war, rather there are specific wars, lots of different wars. So would you say, I mean, obviously we're generalizing and you've been generalizing so well, but what about that issue of the specificity of dehumanization when it's done by the Hutus relative to the Tutsis, as opposed to the Nazis relative to Jews?
Yes.
To what extent should we recognize the heterogeneity of dehumanization?
I think there are a number of variables which give any example of dehumanization its distinctive characteristics. So one is the content of dehumanization, like who is being dehumanized at this historical moment. And there's an historical story that's going to throw light on that. And each of these circumstances is unique. So the dehumanization of the Rohingya in Myanmar now, right? There's some very particular circumstances that makes it the case that this group of people is dehumanized in this way. Well, what about in this way? Well, that pertains to culture, right? Thinking of others as dogs really works in cultures where a dog is a paradigmatically unclean animal rather than man's best friend, right? So there's sort of a cultural symbolic language. There's the historical specificity, and then of course, and those two vary, right? What I think doesn't vary is the psychology involved, the psychology that filters these forces. There, I think we're dealing with something which is just, I don't like the term human nature, but if I have to use it, it's human nature.
So in your description of lynchings, and they're not just graphic descriptions by you, you did a lot of work and unearthed these horrific, blood-curdling, toe-curling descriptions of what was done. Yeah. Often, at least with regard to lynchings, it seems, one of the main motivating factors seems to have been worry about sex. It seems like a black man was accused of whistling at a white woman or looking at her wrong, or of course raping her, although in virtually no cases, as far as I can tell, did that actually happen. So I'm wondering about that, and about that, how that might be influenced by the notion of monsterism. If one doesn't perceive African Americans as quite human, then there's a sexual threat. Is there a threat of unconscious threat of hybridization somehow that enhances the anger?
Well, yeah, certainly. And actually hybridization, if we're talking about this example, there was a very distinguished biologist who actually said that, interracial marriages or interracial sex produces hybrids. And he meant this quite literally.
Literally, yeah.
Quite literally. You know, the idea there is the black male is bestial and powerful. Powerful because he's a monster.
Yeah.
Bestial because he's a beast, right? And so sexual anxieties get woven into that. But I think I have a lot more theorizing to do on this dimension. For a number of years, I thought I've got to properly tackle this. There's something more there, because we find it in the case of Jews in the Holocaust. We find it in the case of Rohingya in Myanmar. It's a very common feature of genocidal or quasi-genocidal violence.
And it usually is the anxiety about the males, it seems.
Yes,
right?
yes. So in genocides, generally, males are the main target, the first target and the main target.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the Holocaust, when the mobile killing units were following the German army through Poland and the Soviet Union and the Baltic states, and they were mopping up, killing, well, millions of Jews with bullets. I forgot where I was going to go with that. What did you ask me?
Well, it was the question of the role of sexuality, of sexual anxiety, and how it is that males seem to be primarily.
Oh, yes. So they first killed all the males, and that was like a warm-up for killing women and children, which was emotionally more demanding for them. And that's very, very, very common. Kill the males, kill the male children.
Yeah. Rape
the women, rape the young women.
Okay, there you go.
Take them into sexual slavery. Hell, we find it in the Bible, in the book of Joshua. God commands Moses to get his troops to do exactly this.
Yeah.
To the unfortunate residents of the Promised Land.
Right. So how I come back to that issue then of where it's all coming from. And I guess I do have some, but maybe as a biologist, although I've learned my lesson, you know, we don't really talk about, it's not appropriate, it's not even correct in many cases to speak about instincts the way I think many of my colleagues, and to some extent I did several decades ago. I think we now know that every phenotype, every behavior is a result of the interaction. And yet there's got to be something there that is evoked.
Yes, sure.
And so it's not produced, obviously, it's not produced entirely by even the most nasty and effective charismatic leader. So in terms of your ultimate optimism, and again, I'm struck by it, we all need it these days. I guess your sense then is that the fact that there is something within us, there's something.
We have something to work with. That's how I'd like to put it. We have vulnerabilities, psychological vulnerabilities that make us prone to manipulation by skilled propagandists and ideologues and authoritative people or pseudo-authoritative people. And that's built in, and there's no vaccine for it. It's like COVID, right? There's no vaccine, but there's never going to be one, because it's about how our minds work. That's why psychological education is important, because if we don't understand the nature of those vulnerabilities, which I try to describe in the book, then we can't be vigilant. You know, it's hard to notice when we're slipping into these ways of thinking.
Know your enemy, essentially. And
and the enemy is
us. Well, that famous line from Pogo, the old cartoon, right? I've met the enemy and he is us. So you make a really effective, you make all sorts of effective points, but one of them as well that relates here is that notion of essentialism. And certainly that's a problem that has to be confronted. It also strikes me as being a potential benefit. You said it's something we could work with, that essentialism of Homo sapiens, recognizing that the humanness, the humanity of others. And yet there's the other side of that essentialism when it's turned around.
The problem is that, so the essentialism is very flexible, right? So thinking of others as human is, I think, amounts to psychologically attributing an imaginary human essence to them. You know, we know, actually, since particularly Ernst Mayr, that that's the wrong way to think about biological taxa. So the way that the concept of human actually works is it means one of us. It means our kind. So we don't notice humanness in others. We grant it. It's an act of identification or inclusion. This is at the fancy conceptual level rather than that gut level response that we have to one another. Yeah, and unfortunately, if we look at how it works, even in paleoanthropology. So someone comes along and says, well, science has proven that human equals Homo sapiens. No. If you look at how the category is used, sometimes it's genus Homo, sometimes it's Homo sapiens sapiens, sometimes it's every ancestor since the common ancestor with the chimpanzee lineage. It's really all over the map, even in paleoanthropology. And then if we look at cultures like the Jivaro, right, it's a very narrow conception, right? Human is our community, our ethnicity. Everyone else is by default less non-human and in effect less than human. So it can be very broad, it can be very narrow. And that's a problem with it. So we gotta keep it right. You know, ultimately the question the ultimate question with all of this stuff is, in terms of motivating people to read my book, which means, you know, the idea, and this is sincere, motivating people to think about these very important topics, is what kind of a world do we want to live in? And what kind of steps do we need to take to try and secure that kind of world? That's why I wrote the book. That's why I think all this stuff needs attending to. And that's why we need to actually carefully police the concept of the human. So it is, at minimum, includes every member of our species. That's at minimum. It should also include my dog, but.
Absolutely. Well, this has really been wonderful, David. I think we've been going a little over an hour. Is there anything that we've missed? I mean, there's plenty that we've missed, I should say, but is there anything at this point in our conversation that you would like to add? Maybe
I'd like to close by reading a paragraph. And that's from the first chapter of my book, which is primarily autobiographical. And it goes like this. There is a brutally poignant Jewish joke, one that stabs you in the heart rather than makes you laugh, about Saul, the village idiot. Because of Saul's intellectual deficits, he's regarded as unemployable, but the village rabbi, undeterred, creates a job for him. Saul's job is to sit on a chair on the outskirts of the shtetl and wait for the Messiah to arrive. One day, a traveler approaches, and seeing Saul sitting there all alone, staring intently into the distance, the traveler asks him what he's doing. "It's my job," says Saul. "I'm waiting for the Messiah. The pay is bad, the hours are long, but it's steady work." Perhaps I'm a fool like Saul, because despite my pessimism, I am nonetheless hopeful that we may be able to see our way through to making a more humane world and fashion a future that is less hideous than the nightmare of our past.
Amen, brother.
Thank you, David. It was a joy talking with you.
Vice versa, ditto, etc. Evan, I don't know if you're still there. We can keep going.
Hi. No, this has been wonderful. I want to be sensitive to both of your times since we've gone a little over. There were a few questions. Do you guys have a little more time to?
I'm happy to take questions.
Sure.
That's okay. Okay. The first one I have is I think just someone's wanting a little more clarity around the difference between considering essentially between othering and dehumanizing, and since I think that's a really important point, we should maybe address that if you don't mind.
So the idea of othering involves placing people at a distance. It involves saying, look, they are in some crucial respects different from my crowd. That might be on the basis of religion. It might be on the basis of racialization. It might be on the basis of gender. It might be on the basis of sexual orientation. There are all kinds of ways this can happen. But it doesn't require thinking of the otherized person as subhuman, right? So it's a much bigger concept. So when I talk about, say, people in my neighborhood with Trump and Pence signs in their front yard, and I speak of them disapprovingly, well, that's kind of low-grade othering, right? When people disparage Muslims because of their religious beliefs or their national origin, that's othering. But neither of those cases involves seeing the other person, conceiving of the other person as literally less than human. So that's the distinction I want to draw here.
I would add, by the way, that one thing that you describe really quite well in your book is an old biological concept, the great chain of being.
Yeah.
Where all these critters lined up, but they get higher and higher and higher, and then eventually they reach Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
That really bespeaks, that's not so much othering, as that really does speak to the ranking.
The ranking, which is vital in dehumanization, right? Hierarchy. Yeah.
Thank you guys. So I have another question. This one is from Charles, and he's wondering, what are your, this is posed to you both. What are your thoughts about the phenomenon of whites, typically activist women, presenting themselves as Black? I'm interested in this in terms of weirdness and monstrosity. That these women have been called disgusting, bizarre, etc. There's been very little sympathy shown to these people. And then related but different, the characterization of whites as old white men or cis, and the dismissiveness that whites may encounter in the current climate. Is this othering and borderlining on dehumanization? Is it the same phenomenon?
It's certainly othering. I mean, you know, when you disparage someone as different and speaking as an old white cis man or someone who would be regarded as such, it's quite disturbing. But of course, anyone with imagination who's able to put themselves, no matter what their age and no matter what their color and no matter what their gender, unless your imagination is impoverished, you understand that this is a very, very disparaging thing to say. Now that kind of links to the prior question, which is a very interesting question, and I would have to speak at some length to respond properly to it. I'm a race skeptic. I don't believe in race. Now people say, are you colorblind? No, I believe in variation. But the notion of race, which is the notion of these different, fundamentally different kinds of people, I think is a toxic illusion. And by the way, I argue in the book why I think it's false, a false idea and a dangerous idea. And part of the reason of its dangerousness is that groups of people who are dehumanized are almost always first racialized, first situated as a separate and alien race. So I can't give a concise response to the first question, except my general racial skepticism plays into it. I think the idea of seeing these people as in some way monstrous and abhorrent, that's very interesting. I hadn't really thought of that angle in relation to my own work, and I will devote some more thought to that.
Yeah, I would add with regard to that as a biologist that I think we really are misled by our excessive susceptibility to vision, looking at color, skin color alone. And at this point, there have been some recent studies, actually they're not that recent, that if one looks at the genotypes, the genomic studies of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa alone, there is significantly more genetic diversity in sub-Saharan Africa alone among humans than there is in all the rest of the planet put together.
Yeah.
So, you know, the temptation to say, well, they're all Black Africans, so that's one race. Well, by contrast, if you take the Mongolians and the Japanese and the Native Americans and the Northern Europeans, there's less variation there than there is in sub-Saharan Africa. So the meaning of race at a fundamental level really falls apart. And
it really does.
That's an important point. Yeah.
Thank you both, and thanks for that question. I think this is a good one to end on. It's from Dan, who wants to know, how do we resolve dehumanization? Dan gives a couple of proposals, such as revamping education to require cultural anthropology, cross-cultural and nature field trips, etc. Also noting that his mischievous side also imagines publicly shaming anyone publishing dehumanizing statements. What do you think?
Dehumanize them. Actually, this is obviously for David to answer. I want to give my not entirely serious answer very briefly. It's my favorite quote from Franz Kafka, where he wrote, "There is hope, but not for us." So
Ooh, that's good.
That's not altogether optimistic. David's considerably more optimistic. So it's all yours, man.
Uncharacteristically so. So the subtitle of my book is Dehumanization and How to Resist It. And there I say something about that throughout the book in scattered little places, but the final chapter is specifically devoted. And I think there are a number of things we can do, but they're not magical solutions. We have to keep pushing the arc of history towards justice. And we have to keep the pressure on it, because if we don't keep the pressure on it, it's going to bend back the other way. So how do we keep the pressure on it? I've already alluded to two things. One is understanding enough about ourselves to understand our vulnerability to dehumanizing forces, dehumanizing political forces. We have to know what it is about our minds that makes us prone to adopt these, let's face it, weird ideas that others are subhuman, monstrous beings. And just by the way, it needn't be explicit, that the idea that they're monsters or demons needn't be explicitly in that form. So the idea of inherent criminality is a secular version of demonicness. Terrorist is a demonic image. So that's one part, sort of education in self-knowledge. Another part, which I alluded to, is learning history properly. Real history should be part of everyone's education. It should be much more prominent than it is. And I can tell you, I teach college students, undergraduates, a course called Race, Racism, and Beyond, where we go into some of the stuff I talk about in the book. And these kids knew nothing. I mean, they really knew nothing. They had what I call the cartoon version of the history of race. There was slavery, and well, maybe it wasn't all that bad. And then there was something called Jim Crow, which no one knows exactly what it is, but it involved the back of a bus. Then there was the civil rights movement, and then there's Black Lives Matter. I mean, that's with very slight exaggeration, that represents the level of understanding. And this should be something that every American understands. And the sites of lynchings and genocidal massacres of Native Americans, and so they should all be memorialized. Just like Auschwitz is memorialized, just like Sachsenhausen is memorialized, these should be memorialized. So on the other hand, there are more outward-looking elements. So supporting institutions that at least have the potential to keep us safe, a free press, a free judiciary, freedom of speech, a vigilant press which tracks dehumanizing rhetoric. Now, unfortunately, all of those things, those latter things, can be bent towards fascist ends, right? I mean, Nazis are always, back in the 1920s, they're always complaining about restrictions on their free speech. Dr. Goebbels joke that it's a supreme irony of history that democracy has given us the very tool of its undoing, by which he meant freedom of speech. So there are no guarantees. Well, there are no guarantees anywhere here. We just got to do the best we can. And we're not going to do very well unless we understand what we're up against. So I come back to that. That's why I wrote the book. We need to understand what we're up against.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Dan, for that question. This has been a great conversation. I should maybe just point out, following on that, that On Inhumanity is a great primer if you're looking for an accessible introduction to thinking more about dehumanization.
Actually, if I could add just one quick thing, which is my only serious criticism of this book, and it's not a criticism of you, David. You had, I'm sure, virtually essentially nothing to do with it. It's that old line, don't judge a book by its cover. This is a great book, but the cover is really crappy.
Oh, I love the cover. I love the cover.
Do you? To me, it doesn't say anything. I just, you know, at least I did not judge the book by the cover. I thought, what a boring looking cover.
Well, this is an aesthetic.
I would urge people listening, don't judge the book by the cover, at least as far by my judgment. Yeah.
I want to add before we leave a pitch for David's most recent book, Threats, Intimidation, and Its Discontents. I blurbed the book. It's an awesome book. It's really, really, really good. So, you know, put that on your reading list.
Thank you, David. And yeah, hopefully we'll be able to have David back for an event more focused on threats. But for tonight, thank you both for being here so much and for this conversation. For the rest of you who tuned in, thank you. There are links to purchase the books, both books. Just scroll down a little bit. You'll see them in orange links. Hope to see you guys in person at some point in the nearest future. But until then, please continue to stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you here on the internet. So take care, y'all. Thank you for being here, and good night.
Good night.